Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Lincoln Davies, and along with my co-director of the Stegner Center, Brig Daniels, we're delighted to welcome you here today to our Greenbag, which is going to address climate of contempt, political partisanship, climate action, and the energy transition. Before we begin, let me just take a moment to acknowledge where we are and where we stand. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indians communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Also, before we begin, let me just draw your attention briefly to our online calendar, which you can find by Googling Stegner Center events. On April 3rd, we have coming up at 3:30 to 5 p.m. Unworthy Republic, the Disposition of Native Americans in the Road to Indian Territory, which is sponsored by the American West Center with the support of the Stegner Center itself. And then on April 14th, we're going to have an online CLE, which will address the Trump presidency and the environment. Will feature many of our Stegner faculty as well as friends of the Stegner Center, addressing a variety of different ways in which policy and law under the Trump administration are changing on the environment and resource questions. So today's Greenbag is a special treat. It's going to be an interview between our Dean of Utah Law, Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and author David Spence from the University of Texas. So this is going to be a conversation in part based on a book that recently came out from Professor Spence called Climate of Contempt: How to Rescue the U.S. Energy Transition from Voter Partisanship. As societal discourse becomes increasingly divisive, how do we address climate change and protect our democracy at the same time? So let me take just a moment to introduce our speakers. As I mentioned, Professor Spence will be interviewed by our Dean of the Law School, Elizabeth Kronk Warner, who is the Jefferson B. and Rita E. Fordham Presidential Dean and Professor of Law here at the Law School. She is a nationally recognized expert in the intersection of environmental and Indian law. She teaches courses on property, Indian law, environmental and natural resources law, and supervised the Tribal Judicial Support Clinic at the University of Kansas Law School, where she was before she joined our law school. She also is a passionate advocate of our students and has coached several moot court competitions. She's received excellence in teaching awards, co-authored over 40 articles and several books on environmental issues, and including energy development on native lands, including recent articles in the Virginia Law Review and the California Law Review. She's also a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of the Chippewa Indians. And as I mentioned, she'll be interviewing David Spence, who is the Rex G. Baker Centennial Chair in Natural Resources Law at the University of Texas Law School, where he also holds an appointment in the business school. So Professor Spence is bringing a lot of different perspectives here, business law, and he has a PhD in political science. Professor Spence is a leading expert in energy law and policy, having published articles in some of the leading energy outlets, including Energy Policy, Nature Energy, articles in the Notre Dame Law Review, in Emory Law Review, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and on and on. If you're interested in his book, there are some books available from the University of Utah bookstore, which has joined us today just outside. And then finally, let me say, if you have questions, there will be time for questions from the audience, both online and here in the moot courtroom toward the end of the presentation. So to do that, we ask you to put your questions into Slido. If you just go to slido.com and put in Stegner, you can ask questions, and the more people who like your question moves it to the top of the queue. And then finally, let me thank our donors. The Cultural Vision Fund, its generous support of the Stegner Center has made it possible for us to bring Professor Spence here today to Salt Lake City to host this presentation. And with that, please join with me in welcoming Professor David Spence and Dean Elizabeth Kronk Warner.
Thank you so much, Professor Davies. And I just have to say, listening to you go over the events that we still have yet to come this academic year, I'm just so impressed with everything you and Professor Daniels have done and everybody at the Stegner Center has done in terms of creating a great lineup of events. So thank you so much. And I'm so excited to have you here, Professor Spence. Thank you so much for making the trip. We met each other about a year ago at an energy conference at Texas A&M, and I remember saying, please, please, please come and present at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. We'd love to hear from you. So it is just a privilege to have you here about a year later.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and to the university for having me, and the law school, and to Lincoln and Brig, who are friends of mine. And it was great to meet you last year. I'm really happy to be here on such a lovely day and such a beautiful building.
Yes, you picked a good day to be here. I'm very excited to talk to you about your book, as it touches on so many vital issues of our day. And it's especially important for us as higher education institutions to really lean into this idea of education and exploring issues from different viewpoints. So we're excited to have today's conversation. And I certainly want to get into the book, but first let me ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this was definitely a get it off my chest book. That these are ideas that were sort of bubbling around inside me for a long time, and it really came from my perception that a lot of these ideas weren't really fully represented, particularly in certainly in the public debate over climate change and the energy transition, but also in parts of the academic debate as well. And so I wanted to get these ideas, most of which come from political science, sort of out into the ether and hope that they would be recognized and debated and challenged and become part of the academic discourse.
Great. And I know that it's really impossible with a book as rich and well-researched as yours is, but what's your elevator speech for the book? What do you kind of hope that folks take away today about your book?
Yeah. So there's really a central dynamic that I'm hoping people will focus on, which you find in the middle of the book, chapters 3 and 4. The first half of the book is a history of the creation and evolution of the energy regulatory state, including environmental law. So if you want a sort of history of that, that's a place you can get it. And we do have CLE credit here, so that's where the law is. But most of this is about politics, and the political dynamic that I really wanted to get people to focus on has sort of two parts to it. One is that members of Congress, whose help we will need to further the energy transition, members of Congress respond today to different sets of voters than they did in the past, because most of them represent safe seats. Something like 80 to 85% of them represent safe seats. That means that they face no risk of losing the general election. Their only risk to getting reelected is losing the primary. And so they must respond to primary voters who, by and large, are more extreme ideologically, even within their own party, than the average member, and certainly than the average constituent that they represent. And that's what drives congressional polarization, and most people have understood this, for a long time. The second part, I think, is less well understood, which is that all voters, but especially these voters who seem to drive what members of Congress do, are becoming more negatively partisan over time. And this I credit to the change in the media environment, the information environment in which we live. So data show, and I recount the data in the book, that in the 21st century, our attitudes toward members of the other party have just dove south, right? We essentially report that, at least huge percentages of members of each party report essentially hating members of the other party. And so it's that negative partisanship that is the new factor. The polarization started back in the 20th century, and it's just continued. And if you look at the evolution of our modern media environment, you can sort of see why, right? We all have fragmented news sources. We're seeing censored news based on algorithms and also our own behavior. We then process that news very quickly and among like-minded groups of friends online, and we wind wind each other up and become even more. We reinforce both the polarization and the negative partisanship. That was a long elevator ride, sorry, but that's the best I could do.
Yeah, and I remember I was really surprised by the first point you mentioned. I'm of course aware about social media and its effects on society, but your point about how folks are really having their kind of real battles in the primaries instead of the general elections was definitely something that I appreciated learning more about. So towards that end, obviously during your research process, I'm assuming that you learned many things that you didn't kind of expect when you first started out on this book project. Could you share maybe the most surprising or the most interesting thing that you learned through your research?
Yeah, I mean, nobody's asked me that question. I've done a lot of book events the last year, or last few months, but the most interesting things that I learned came from researching fields outside of my own. So I was aware of what political scientists had to say about these phenomena that I just described. It was interesting to learn what academics in other disciplines, particularly communications and media studies, information studies, psychology, social psychology, had to say about these same things. All these disciplines are studying what the internet is doing to our brains and the way we communicate with one another and the way we gather information and the way we form political beliefs. And a lot of the news is not good that they're finding, but what was interesting was how much those bodies of research dovetail. They seem to be reaching, in many cases, very either similar or consistent conclusions. And so that was encouraging because the stuff that I was aware of from political science had additional sort of support for it. And I'm really referring now to sort of that sort of speed of both gathering information and forming beliefs, and the fractured or isolated or insulated way in which those beliefs get formed really quickly. We become too certain too quickly about too many things, and then it becomes easy to sort of see the other point of view as absurd or wrong or silly or worthy of mockery.
How quickly do we form beliefs?
Well, if you think about how we did it for those of you that are my age, when I was a kid, when I was at the age of law students today, we got the news once a day from a half-hour newscast at night or a daily paper, and we didn't get more news till the next day, most likely. And we had time to read every story to the last paragraph, where all the qualifications and the nuance and the complexity is. And we talked about it face to face with friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, and we could credit or discredit their views based on what we knew about them. And the way we talked about it was different because we wanted to preserve those relationships. We didn't start with some bold declaratory statement about how stupid some point of view is. It was cautious and iterative and based on questions, and we sort of sounded each other out. And so that's a way of sort of deciding what you believe about politics that's very different from what happens now, especially among people who live a lot of their political life online. And spoiler alert, those people who vote in primaries are the ones that do that, right? So it's very different. It's faster. You can talk about the news that you heard 2 minutes ago immediately with your social media group. And maybe those people have heard the same news you have. Maybe they've seen different news. They're unlikely to present you with reasonable versions of opposing points of view because the group itself is also censored.
That's fascinating. Hearing you talk made me nostalgic. Growing up, we would have dinner at 5:30, and then at 6 o'clock we'd sit down to watch Dan Rather on CBS, and every night we'd say, "Good night, Dan." Those good memories. Well, let's
out loud.
Yes, as if you could hear. Let's go ahead and get into your book. So we'll start off with the energy and environmental law policy history that you mentioned. So early on, you spent some time tracing the history of energy and environmental regulation in the United States. You talk about how different quote unquote Republican moments have been the pivotal points that have led to national legislation and the fields as we now know them. Could you walk us through what those are for environmental and energy law?
Yeah, the phrase Republican moments is not mine. It comes from another scholar, and this is small r Republican, so it's referring to bottom-up groundswells of demand for, major regulatory legislation. And the the first part of the book begins with a chapter that sort of traces those major regulatory statutes and their creation, or looks at the politics of their creation. And it turns out that most of the regulatory action in our history has taken place within really tiny windows of time when you had both that groundswell and this is an additional necessary requirement, a receptive partisan environment in Congress. So the sort of three windows in which Congress was especially productive in this regard were the 30 years straddling the turn of the 20th century, so progressive and populist movements which sort of butt up against one another. Then the 6 years of the New Deal, and then what some people call the environmental decade of the 1970s, which is really more than a decade, but it's the period when a lot of the environmental safety, health, consumer protection laws were passed. And if you look at those Congresses and how they did what they did, the receptive partisan environment was either of two kinds. It was either a situation where the issue was new and both parties were competing, or at least some people within both parties were competing to become identified with the issue so as to satisfy voters and win more votes in the future. So Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. They came from different parties. They were both trying to get the mantle of progressivism. And in those contexts, when two parties are competing, you get bipartisan support in Congress for these bills. Same thing in the environmental era when you got lots of bipartisan support for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. All those laws had a lot of bipartisan support. The other environment in which, other condition in which you can have a receptive partisan environment is when one party has so much power that they don't need the help of the other party. And as most people know, that was the New Deal, right? So this is another surprise in my research. I didn't realize how much dominance Democrats had during the New Deal. In the 6 years during which all those regulatory statutes were passed, the smallest margins that Democrats had in the House of Representatives was 196 seats.
Wow.
That is, they had 196 more seats than Republicans, and that was the smallest of those three Congresses in terms of their margins. So they could do whatever they wanted. And so what you find in these eras is that all these laws were passed with 75% support or more of both houses of Congress. Yeah, so that's a very different set of conditions than we see today, right?
Yes. So speaking of the small r Republican moments, in what spaces or what areas of law do you think that would be possible today, if it is possible today?
Yeah. If you look at polling data, so there's different ways to think about this, but when it comes to the issue the book addresses, which is climate change and the transition to a cleaner or lower carbon energy system, it's getting harder and harder because of the turn against renewable energy and clean energy that the Republican Party has taken in just the last few years. And that may be a response to the leadership at the top. Donald Trump doesn't like green energy. So maybe if there's a different standard bearer, that will change because rank and file Republicans report significant support for renewable energy. And so, what I was going to say was that's a preface to the idea that if we can divide things into smaller, bite-sized chunks, policies into smaller bite-sized chunks, there's room for bipartisan agreement on certain things, or at least enough to get it through the legislature. And we see this manifested in the letter that 29 House Republicans sent to Mike Johnson, the Speaker, recently, urging him not to repeal at least major chunks of the Inflation Reduction Act because they liked the incentives and the subsidies and other policies that were included in those provisions. And so if we avoid the word climate change and we focus on those sort of really narrow issues, there may be opportunities for, if not Republican moments in the sense of a massive groundswell of support, enough support to get the idea through the legislative process.
Fascinating. So speaking of the Inflation Reduction Act, how would you compare an earlier Republican moment, such as the adoption of the Clean Air Act, and the more modern ones, such as the failure to adopt federal greenhouse gas limits, but instead to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, obviously the most glaring difference is that the Inflation Reduction Act passed without a single Republican vote. and there wasn't overwhelming Democratic dominance. There was just enough Democratic dominance, in that, and which is why Joe Manchin, former senator from West Virginia, became sort of, president of the country for a little while. At least legislatively, he decided what would be in that bill and what wouldn't, because his vote was necessary for it to pass. And so, so the big difference is that we can't get that kind of overwhelming groundswell in Congress of support for at least strong climate policy these days. And so we got something else. We got a series of carrots instead of sticks. And maybe that's the kind of policy that might continue to be at least popular enough to create new legislation that can sort of further move the energy transition forward. But the prospects don't look great right now for that. And so we're sort of stuck with the kinds of things that we have presently and defending the gains that were made in like the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, which seem to be under attack from the current administration. Yeah. By the way, am I being heard back there? I can hear my voice trailing off, so I want to make sure you're hearing me. Thank you.
Good. Everyone can hear you. So you write in the book that, quote, the fracturing of political information and belief makes today's partisan divide less like the divide of the 1930s and 1960s than like the divide in the 1850s. Can you talk to us about that? Unpack it. What do you mean?
So for most of the 20th century, the progress in technological process in mass media acted as a kind of centripetal force. It brought people together. It gave people a common source of information. The national, first the wire services, then sort of, which fed both national and local newspapers, and then radio and TV. These were news divisions that were staffed by reporters who were trained to at least aspire to objectivity and to write for a broad audience, an ideologically broad audience. And so that was a period of time sort of almost, with at least now seeming almost like a blip in our history, when everybody was operating from a sort of a common set of facts, and we were hearing from, we were reading news that was aimed at a broader population. Before that, of course, everybody was in their geographically isolated communities. Since then, we're starting to be in equally isolated communities, but online, right? So it's the great irony that we're flooded with information, but we don't have a common understanding of what's true. This is the post-truth world that internet technology has brought to us, and so. When you don't have that sort of common understanding of facts, and when you don't see reasonable representations of opposing points of view, it becomes easier and easier to hate one another. And that's where the word contempt comes from in the title of the book. The National Election Study asks a tracking poll, runs a tracking poll since 1978, asking people how they feel about members of the opposing party on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being couldn't hate them more, 100 being couldn't love them more. And all the way through the end of the 20th century, partisans of each party reported mildly negative views of the other. But in the last reported data, which was 2022, we're about to get the 24 data, the median score is below 20 for each, and the percentage of respondents who are willing to ascribe a score of 0 to the other party is in the high 30s or low 40s. Wow. So those are disturbing data.
Yeah, and that leads nicely into kind of another theme of the book, which is partisanship. And one thing you talk about in the book is how partisan the United States has become, as you've mentioned here today. I think that's probably something that we all are feeling. Is this something here happening just in the United States, or is this a global phenomenon?
So, the internet is having destructive effects on politics beyond the borders of the United States. I think the specific phenomenon that I'm describing is also amplified by just the structure of our political system. So we represent, members of Congress represent single-member geographic districts. There's no sort of party. You don't vote for a party. You vote for a candidate in your district. The gerrymandering and self-sorting that has created safe seats in the first place is exacerbating or amplifying the voices of the most extreme people, whereas in a proportional representation system, if you have two major parties, a center-right and a center-left party, there's still the incentive on the national politicians' part to sort of tack to the middle and gain as many votes as you can that way. So it's different in different places, and it seems to be particularly destructive here. I get to spend a lot of time in the UK, and people come up and ask, what's going on over there, and when it comes to things like climate or other issues where there's a history of sort of government intervention in Europe, transportation, all kinds of infrastructural things where the government provides more there than they do here. That seems to be a bipartisan phenomenon there in ways that it isn't here. And I would chalk that up to the structure of our political competition and the various other dynamics I just described.
Fascinating. So where do these trends in negative partisanship and increased ideological polarization leave us in terms of opportunities to act on climate change? Should we just forego the idea of a national plan as it's not something that can be agreed to? Is it all up to the states, or do you see a different picture potentially?
So everything's been kind of depressing so far, and the last chapter is called Hope and Conversation. So there's two things. First of all, there are reasons to feel good. So I do think that at the national level, for the time being, it's more about defending gains than making new gains when it comes to furthering the energy transition. But that doesn't change the fact that there are many states in which lots of progress is being made. And there are private sector forces that are pushing the transition along as well. The fact that wind and solar power are cheap, the cheapest sources of energy on a per kilowatt hour basis, and that corporate buyers want that, and that there are lots of parts of the country where those technologies have not saturated the market yet, so that there's lots of win-win opportunities of bringing prices down and getting a cleaner energy mix. That, to the extent that politicians don't throw roadblocks in the way of that, that's a force that's going to push the transition along. And then every time we have a Republican in the White House, blue states tend to get really aggressive about the transition. So the last time Donald Trump was in the White House, a whole bunch of states enacted aggressive goals to decarbonize their electricity sectors. And so I imagine we'll still see those forces working. In my state of Texas, the state legislators are exploring ways to throw roadblocks in the way of that transition and give a leg up to gas-fired power and impose on renewable energies certain requirements that other types of technologies don't have to meet, and things like that. So there's reason for hope that way. But I do think that in the long run, the only way to stop this slide toward sort of demonizing one another and getting more and more polarized and more negatively partisan is to try to recreate ways of talking to each other across partisan and ideological boundaries that we had way back when I was a kid, right? So you don't have to completely get offline and only talk to people face to face, but you do have to talk to people from other points of view. You do have to expose yourself to reasonable portrayals of other points of view, not the crazy ones you see on The Daily Show or the ones that are brought to your social media group to be pointed at and laughed at, right? So to find people who are reasonable purveyors of differing points of view and talk to them about these issues in ways that mimic the way we used to talk to each other face to face. And you can do this online or face to face, but the last 20 years have encouraged people not to talk to each other face to face about politics and these kinds of tough issues. And so that skill set needs to be developed. And so the last chapter is about bodies of research that suggest that those kinds of iterative, questioning, careful conversations can help remedy the problem, the state we're in. That's what that last chapter is about, and that was an encouraging one to write because, again, I was looking at literatures that I wasn't familiar with, and they had encouraging things to say about what's possible, but we still have to do it.
Great. So in the book, you talk about the role of the, quote, propaganda machine in driving political division. Are you talking about social media, or is there something else that's part of the propaganda machine?
I use that term to refer to the combination of ideological media crowding out traditional media and social media. So together, ideological and social media are what I refer to as the propaganda machine. So if you look at the history, chapter 4 of the book traces the history of the rise of those kind of media, which is mostly a 21st century phenomenon, and it has it's become harder and harder for those journalists who serve broad audiences and were trained to aspire to objectivity and completeness to compete with advocacy journalists and press releases and bots and Substacks and podcasts, right? Which tend to be more about persuasion than education, right? So they may be educating you, but they're also doing so in service of a persuasive goal of some kind. And so people become skeptical about all information, and to the extent we consume those types of ideological media and get into a social media group that sort of reinforces and amplifies all those messages, we actually become lobbyists too. So when you're talking online, very different from talking to someone face to face, not only because of how you converse, but also because there's a possible audience out there. You don't know who they are. And so when you have an audience, then maybe the goal of persuading the other person to your point of view right now becomes more important, and understanding them and listening to them becomes less important because of that audience that's out there that you may want to influence. And these media for discussion, many of them are very space constrained, which it makes it hard to talk about anything complex or interesting. Yeah. It's easier to denigrate and sort of run people away or condemn or disdain things than it is to actually get involved in discussions about complex issues like climate change. And so we become all part of the propaganda machine in the end, right? If we're doing these kinds of things online. And it's not just intentionally misleading people, it's things like forwarding studies that support my point of view and not the ones that don't, right? Or there's all kinds of ways this happens that change the way we're communicating with one another. And so that's what the book is aimed at, identifying and trying to change.
Yeah. And you mentioned how, kind of new developments in this space, like chatbots, as you said, are impacting. What about AI? Will AI amplify social media's role in polarizing society or have some other effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm only a consumer of AI. I don't have any expertise in the field, or I don't know how large language models are trained, other than that they're trained on what's out there. Yeah. The other day I was trying to look up, I wanted to create a figure that showed the size of the Texas energy grid over time, because it's been growing so fast in generating capacity. And I Googled something about ERCOT, which is the name of the grid, generating capacity year by year or something like that. And I knew, that it's in the 130 gigawatt range now. And I got from the AI response, 1,800 megawatts, which is less than 1% of the size of the grid, right? So I don't know where that came from. Normally, I don't get those kind of responses. So, but I worry that being trained on some bad information can cause feedback loops on some of these things. But overall, there's if the way these things are being trained improves them over time, then perhaps finding out, if you ask the right question, finding out, is this true? This thing someone in my social media group just said. Ideally, that might be a quick way to find out, well, no, not exactly. I mean, that would be a nice outcome in terms of how AI influences our ability to learn the whole truth about things. But, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't really know.
Fair. So in your book, I thought it was really interesting. At one point, you discussed this social science experiment where two groups read the same article, and those predisposed against the death penalty concluded that the article supported their position, and the group that was predisposed to favor the death penalty concluded that it supported their position. So why does this matter? And in particular, how does this matter for climate change?
Yeah, that's some of you may be familiar with the Yale Cultural Cognition Project, which is where that study came from, Dan Kahan at Yale. So the phenomena that are being supercharged by social media and ideological media are old phenomena. We have confirmation bias was identified by psychologists in the 1920s. This cultural cognition hypothesis, really its germ was in the 20th century, not the 21st. And so, and those of you who know sociology, Mary Douglas of sociology, social psychologist or anthropologist, I guess, was, a developer of some of these ideas that our social group influences our views really strongly. Perhaps the best example of this were the post-World War II experiments, like the Milgram experiment, more so the Ash experiment, which is the one where people are asked to look at a line, and then they're given three choices of other lines and asked which one is the same length. It's obvious which one is the same length, but everybody else that's being asked is a confederate of the experimenter. There's only one subject, even though they think there are multiple subjects, and all the others give a wrong answer. And when all the others give a wrong answer first, an alarming amount of time, this person gives the wrong answer too.
Oh, interesting.
And they filmed it, so you can see it on YouTube now. You can see the person's expression as the wrong answers are given. But anyway, that's a social sort of, the social element of this, the cultural identity element of this is a really powerful thing. And if you look at the way, I say in the book that Fox News is particularly sophisticated about that aspect of things, the social element of things. It's usually not one person talking at you. It's a group of people. They're friendly. They're reaffirming that, what reasonable people believe and what unreasonable people believe. And it's in a cordial way sometimes, and so the sort of social element of belief formation, I think, is often underappreciated, particularly by academics or non-sociology, non-anthropology academics. And that's become a long-winded answer that has taken me so far from your question that the Yale Cultural Cognition Project is an example of the kind of phenomenon that the internet is amplifying and supercharging.
That's fascinating. Okay, I want to come back to this idea of concluding on hope, right? As you mentioned earlier, and as you mentioned kind of the last chapter of the book. And one solution that you suggest and you've mentioned here today is that individual conversations across difference with people that you don't necessarily agree with. So what are some good ways to do that?
So I rely on other people in the book to sort of help me answer that question. And so some of you probably have heard of, if you're interested in climate issues, Katharine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist and a climate communicator. She wrote an entire book on this topic. But it turns out that her prescription is echoed by a lot of other people, including political scientists who have an idea called deep canvassing, which is about, and these are sort of roadmaps to having these kinds of careful, iterative in the sense of having multiple conversations that involve a lot of active listening, as sort of communications consultants would call it. That is, I quote a friend of mine who's in this field who says, active listening is more than waiting for your turn to talk. It's about actually hearing the other person, taking it in, and using what they say to sort of inform your response. That's exactly the same thing as deep canvassing, which is an idea from political canvassing that was identified or created by a couple of political scientists named Kalla and Brookman. And it's exactly the same thing that Katharine Hayhoe is talking about. And she uses a series of sort of catchwords called bond, connect, and inspire. She says, look, first figure out what you have in common with that person. Then try to connect that to climate issues and the way climate science is affecting that thing you both care about, and then try to just pick that, bite-sized little things you can do together to try and make things better. And so The book, that chapter of the book contains a few sort of hypothetical scripts of the way you might talk to someone who's opposed to a wind farm in your town that you would like to see built, or things like that. And so it's just the stuff we used to do, right? When we didn't have any other choice but to talk to people we knew about these things.
Yeah. So beyond the individual conversations, do you have any suggestions for structural changes?
So behaviorally, getting off the internet is a good thing, or at least in terms of how you consume and process political information. I think it's a good thing. There are people working on broader messaging, ways of doing broader messaging that might create change in the behavior of more acceptance of climate science, basically, by people who are opposed to it now. Our mutual friend Mike Vandenberg at Vanderbilt is working on a lot of this, and I mentioned that in the book as well. In terms of structural changes to the electoral system, there's been lots of suggestions, like packing the Supreme Court and adding senators and approval voting and ranked choice voting, and there's all kinds of things that people would like to see, and which probably would have, particularly those voting things, would probably move things back toward the center. But those require the acquiescence of the very people who are benefiting from the status quo. And so that's why I think this it's a bottom-up problem, and it requires a bottom-up solution. It's a voter-centric solution. So we've got to talk to each other.
Yeah. So I see that many questions have come in on Slido, but before I turn to those questions, anything you'd like to add, or any last comments before we turn to open it up for questions?
No, but I meant to thank up front the people who make events like this actually run, Jan Nystrom and Alyssa Jenkins, and Lily, whose name I didn't get, who's running the sound, whose last name I didn't get. So yeah, I just want to make sure they got acknowledged.
Agree. Thank you. Yes, everyone who works on the events here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law are truly fantastic, so I appreciate that. All right, so let's get to the questions here that have been asked. And the first question is an anonymous question, but asked, while developing the book, did you come across any notable examples where a partisan was strikingly moved by data or similar realization?
You mean individual examples of that? Not a partisan. In the history of sort of climate skepticism, there have been people who are moved by data. So generally speaking, political scientists and communications experts say that a good story beats data every time, and that they've rejected what they call the information deficit theory of persuasion, which is that if everybody had the same information I had, they'd think like me. But there are climate skeptics who've been won over by data, especially experts, people that are in science and therefore, perhaps more, they value data more than the average voter does. So that I'm not familiar with. I didn't cite, and I don't recall encountering, sort of really negative partisans who have changed their mind based on data.
Okay. Our next question comes from a former colleague of ours here from the S.J. Quinney College of Law, who's now at the University of Kansas, Robin Craig. And she asked, do you really think that we can effectively pursue energy transition for climate change in legislative, quote unquote, bite-sized chunks? If so, what small pieces of legislation do you think are most necessary or most likely to get through Congress?
Hi, Robin. Yeah, I think right now, as I say, lots about defense. Now, I would say a couple of things that I think are possible in this next 3.5 years. I think you might be able to see national legislation pushing geothermal energy, in part because it seems to be outside the set of technologies that Republicans don't like. Nuclear as well. Both of those are expensive right now. Nuclear has been expensive for a long time. Geothermals, the kind of geothermal we're talking about is brand new. It's so-called enhanced geothermal, which is basically very deep drilling and fracking, just like for gas, only this time you're getting heat. You're putting water down there. creating a little thermal power plant down on the ground. And I think those technologies, if there's sort of additional legs up that can be given to them, and I think that could possibly happen under the current Congress. I'm not super hopeful, but less skeptical than I am for other things. That I'm kind of hopeful that because of the crisis in electricity demand, maybe we can get some steps forward on transmission siting and building transmission, which would be a huge boon to renewable energy because it's far away from cities and it needs the transmission investment in order there's essentially a lot of pent up investment in wind and solar farms that aren't being built because they don't have a transmission connection. So maybe what I described to a reporter the other day as freaking out about AI servers and the electricity demand that they're bringing to the grid, maybe all of that will help give transmission a bit of a boost. But I wouldn't bet on that. But those are the three least unlikely bite-sized chunks that I can think of.
That's too bad. My interest has been in energy development in Indian country, and lack of transmission lines is one of our biggest challenges in Indian country. So, all right, our next question says, is dark money in campaigns stopping climate change in the U.S. or is something else?
I do talk about sort of what political science has to say about campaign contributions and dark money, and one of my friends at the University of Texas, Tim Warner, is one of the leading scholars on this. In the last election, Kamala Harris raised 3 times as much money as Donald Trump, and she raised more dark money than Donald Trump. So dark money doesn't always win, doesn't always control the day. What that literature I was telling you about says is that that it's about the sort of strategic choices that firms make in terms of how they make campaign contributions, and they do prefer dark money when they feel as though the traceable money will make them look bad, right? So that said, we don't have a whole lot of evidence that money generally is, most of the time controlling political outcomes. What it does do is grant access. And so perhaps if we can infer from that the rich people getting more access means that they can influence decisions before bills get voted on, then perhaps that's a means of money influence. But I think the more important thing is that the billionaires on the right have invested for a long time in amplifying certain messages, anti-regulatory, deregulatory messages, conservative messages, government is bad messages. Billionaires on the left, of which I'm on the left, which we on the left have just as many, have spent their money in different ways. They haven't really focused on messaging the way Republican donors have. And so, my sense from the empirical literature in political science is that we over-ascribe influence to money, even though it's sometimes influential.
That's fascinating. All right, so our next question says, what do you make of the data that in all but a few states, public opinion is by significant majorities worried about climate change and views the issue as important to address? Only North Dakota, Wyoming, and West Virginia appear to be outliers.
Oh, I wasn't even aware of those 3 state exceptions. So again, one of the sort of starting premises of the book is that people want a stronger climate policy because polling tells us that they do. But that the reason we're not getting it is because of the dynamic I described, which is it's not about what people want, it's about what these primary voters want, right? That's what members of Congress are responding to. And red state politicians, like in my state, right? So, for example, our senior senator will be up for election in 2026. He's a traditional conservative. This is John Cornyn, very conservative, but not a populist sort of MAGA type person. But he's going to have a strong primary challenge from our lieutenant governor, who is one of those people. And so I think you're going to see John Cornyn making statements, tweeting, voting in ways that are designed to sort of prove his MAGA credentials so he can survive that primary and then coast to victory in the general election. And so it's about it's not really about what the average person wants, unfortunately, and that's a crisis for democracy. That's why The chapter, my last chapter, quotes Timothy Snyder and a lot of other people who are really worried about the erosion of democratic institutions and the sense of illegitimacy that's growing across the electorate. That's a really big problem.
Yeah. So the
Not
next,
ending on hope. I meant to end on hope. Sorry.
sorry. The next question says we are not addressing climate change sufficiently at this point. I think you would agree with that. What are some of the factors that will help us turn the corner to get back on track?
So my hope is that if we can start talking to our, relatives and friends who are voting for candidates that oppose stronger climate policy or oppose the energy transition, if we can have regular conversations with them about these issues, or at least represent to them our own thinking and feelings about these issues, that as they encounter the harms of climate change, which are, they're just coming, they're already here, but they're coming, and this is not a threshold, it's a continuum, right? So the more we increase atmospheric carbon, the more severe these effects are going to be, and until we stabilize and start to reduce atmospheric carbon, that's going to just be the case. And so if your uncle or grandparent starts to have trouble getting a mortgage for their coastal property or their farm, or has to pay a lot more for it, or has to pay a lot more for insurance, or can't get property insurance because of new climate risks associated with that property, or it's wiped out by a wildfire or a flood. As people start to see these cascading effects, and they're talking to someone who is someone they care about and is representing a point of view to them that is represented more reasonably and more calmly than what they see in their media bubble, my theory or my hope is that that's the kind of behavior or combination of events that can lead to a tipping point at some point. And ideally we ought to do that as quickly as possible in the few remaining districts that are contestable out there in Congress, right? The 15 to 20% where the middle still matters.
So how do you suggest that people respond to, I might be out of battery, so I'll speak loudly. Thank you. How do you suggest that people respond to lies, hypocrisy, and extreme position changes by politicians other than waiting for the next election?
So nothing in my prescription is about not telling the truth. I mean, I think if people are lying, there are ways to point that out that are influential with whatever audience is listening, and potentially productive with the person who's doing the speaking. So I will say that the conversational prescription I say in the book, is probably not going to work on a lot of people. I mean, there's going to be, Catherine Aho thinks everyone's persuadable, but she's a very optimistic person. The polling that I see implies that about a third of people are persuadable in this way, or at least to change their vote anyway. So when someone is, is saying things in your social group or directly to you that are not true, there are ways to get them to audit their own belief, their own facts, that are something other than, no, that's a lie, or no, you're wrong, I'll tell you what's right, right? So, it's things like, why do you say that? Or where did you get that information? Well, why do you believe this? If that premise that you just stated wasn't true, would that change your view? Those kinds of questions, questioning kinds of things, get people to think about their own beliefs, and you're not going to get them to abandon the belief in the first conversation. Right. Yeah. Or the lie. The question was about a lie, right? So, they have to come to it on their own.
So our next question asks, how much of today's polarization is a consequence of spatial self-sorting? So cities versus suburbs, atomization, the disappearance of traditional public forums. It seems to take more effort now to find and interact with different people.
Yeah. A political scientist named Diana Mutz, who's at Penn, I quote her as saying that, she's writing sort of before the pandemic, that the workplace is the last place where we're forced to interact with people that think differently than us, and now maybe that's even going away as everybody works at home, right? So It may take actively sort of subjecting yourself to getting out in the real world and dealing with people who are a broader cross section of America. So one place you see this is if you're on Facebook and you have your like old high school friends on Facebook who've evolved in different directions, right? And I had one of these interactions just the other day with a person I haven't seen in a very long time, who reacted to something, and I don't generally post politics on Facebook, but I did link to an article that was about a particular issue that I thought was particularly insightful, and it had a political dimension to it, and he responded angrily, right? This old friend from high school, and my initial reaction was to respond angrily in return, or snidely anyway, but I didn't, and I waited, and I sort of said something like, I remember I have a lot of fond memories of our time in high school when we did A, B, and C. Probably you and I are getting different sources of information, which is why you think about it. You think this is true, and I think this is true. Maybe we should, both, sort of ask ourselves if we're getting the whole story, something like that. It was longer than that, but and it calmed down the conversation. And I'm hoping that that is one of those little seeds that will get him to audit his own sort of information sources and see if he thinks. See if he's shared, if that belief persists.
Yeah. I recently had that happen on Facebook too. Somebody I went to high school with said something, and I'm like, "What are you talking about? We were both in Miss Takel's second grade class. Like, we both got that same information." So it's interesting how that happens. All right. So the next question asks: are the courts part of the problem here, or part of the solution? I.e., is the court slouching toward naked partisanship made the situation worse?
Yeah, I don't know I probably wouldn't say the court is slouching toward naked partisanship. Some justices maybe, but I do think the court's part of the problem, because the reason that Congress is required is to sort of deal with the energy transition. The reason we can't deal with it without new legislation at the national level is because the court has, over time, adopted such a restrictive view of the authority that Congress can delegate to regulatory agencies, whether it's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the EPA, that it is essentially prevented those agencies from dealing with these kinds of issues, using existing statutory authority to deal with these kind of issues. And so that's explicitly on the court's part a challenge to Congress, saying that Congress, you're the one that has to deal with this, right? But it seems to suggest that Congress is capable of reflecting the durable wishes of the median voter, which they're not right now. Mm-hmm. They're just not. And that's part of the crisis for democracy that we face. And, it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one issue we haven't talked about yet is Citizens United. And this question says, do you address in your book or can you address now the impact of Citizens United decision and industries such as oil and gas industry on the political divide and the leadership at higher levels of the Democratic and Republican parties?
So I do mention Citizens United and the earlier case that, defined contributions as speech. I forget the name of it. Somebody here knows. But in the book. However, I'm reading a subtext into that question, and I apologize if I misinterpret it, but I get the impression that there's a sense that money controls outcomes in Congress, including the so-called corporate Democrat wing of the Democratic Party. And that my book really pushes back against that narrative. And I know it's a popular one, particularly with the younger people, but I don't think the empirical social science supports it. Mm. And we have measures of the ideology of members of Congress that have been used and relied upon for a very long time. And the so-called corporate Democrat wing of the Democrats is much, much closer to the progressive wing ideologically than it is to any Republican. We have no ideological overlap in Congress at all, and we haven't for more than a decade. And that's also an anomaly that goes way, way, way back. So it's true that industry makes a lot of contributions to campaigns And that those contributions are bipartisan. So but the empirical political science work suggests that the people who attract the most money because they're likely to win. They don't win because they attract the most money. And so, I think the moderates in the Democratic Party are moderates because they're moderate. Joe, Joe Manchin, let's take Joe Manchin, right?
Okay.
So here's a guy who has family connections to the coal industry. And you could explain his behavior as sort of based on some sort of mild corruption associated with his connection to the coal industry, or you could explain it by the fact that Donald Trump won his state by 40 some points, and the Cook Political Report lists his state as leaning Republican by 25 points, right? So you could also explain it as sort of, these are my constituents that I have to please, right? We're not yet able to tease out which is true or how much of each is true, but you can't infer that one is true and the other's not.
Great. So bringing it back to Utah a little bit, this next question says, there are some moderate Republicans like Utah Senator John Curtis who advocate for a quote unquote all of the above approach to permitting and regulation reform, which could help renewables too. Is this reasonable to reduce the divisiveness?
Yeah, there was a lot of hope in the end of the last Congress that a permitting reform bill would go through that would reduce regulatory barriers to developing all kinds of infrastructure, both dirty energy infrastructure and clean energy infrastructure. And there are Republicans, and there have been for a long time in Congress, who have formed and joined various climate caucuses in Congress. And so there's rhetorical support for stronger climate policy. None of them voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, not a single one, right? So until we get action from some of the people that say they're in favor of some of these new energy technologies, until we see votes in favor of those sorts of things, it's hard to take the words seriously. And I empathize with them because the first generation of strong Republican climate advocates got booted out of office. Bob Inglis, Carlos Curbelo, these were strong advocates in the Republican Party for environmental and climate stronger policies in those areas, and they lost. They lost in primaries or had to retire before they would lose in a primary. So it's not easy for them. But we're going to find out how they vote when this repeal of the IRA or parts of the IRA comes to the floor, and we'll see.
Yeah. So do you see the effects of climate change ever creating a dystopian reality similar to the Great Depression that would create a similar New Deal political environment in the United States?
So it is true that some sort of catastrophe could generate the type of sharp change in political attitudes, and I'm sure that's possible. During the New Deal, let me back up. So my understanding of climate science, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I try to pay attention to it for sort of professional obligations reasons. My understanding of climate science, and especially the stuff about tipping points, which is what probably the questioner is thinking of. You all know what tipping points are in climate science? So it's the idea that as the Earth warms, certain things happen that suddenly accelerate that warming. So melting the permafrost in Siberia, which will release a lot of methane, and which is a very potent greenhouse gas, and suddenly or the melting of the Greenland ice sheet stopping the Gulf Stream. It's not the Gulf Stream, but it's something called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current. But it's a thing that brings the warm water to Scotland, where I spend a lot of time, and would make Scotland a much less pleasant place to be weather-wise. So my understanding of those tipping points is that the latest science, and this was reflected in the IPCC's latest assessment report, is a little bit encouraging, right? It's not happening imminently. It's getting worse. The AMOC is slowing, but the tipping points are, if they happen, they're far away in time. And so there's time. I don't want people to think there's no time to act. I don't know if they would produce a Mad Max kind of situation or dystopia. I mean, the Dust Bowl was a dystopia for the people in the Dust Bowl. And fortunately, the rest of the country was interested in helping them out. And as part of sort of bringing prosperity to rural communities, which is something I don't know if we would do that now. You know, I don't know in the current environment, information environment, if that would happen.
Yeah. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time together, but I wanted to give you the opportunity for any final comments or thoughts that you would like to share.
No, this has been really a fun way to talk about the book. Usually I give a talk and then there's questions. And so structuring the whole thing through an interview has been fun. No, I think we touched on all of the sort of big parts of the book. I do believe that it's a hopeful book, even though the diagnosis, it doesn't allow a quick fix. So I think, if you want to fix something, you got to understand all the dimensions of it. And some of the dimensions may not be, may be depressing. And yet that doesn't mean they're not addressable. And I am hopeful that we can, that at some point we will stop demonizing one another and enjoying each other's pain and finding policy ways to stick a thumb in the other person's eye, which seems to be where we are right now. But I don't think that can last forever. And I think the prescription in the book, I think, is just one tiny way to try and help move toward a different way of managing these issues.
Great. I love that ending on optimism. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our next Stegner event is April 3rd. We hope that you can continue to join us for that conversation. And thank you so much, Professor Spence, for making the time. I'm so glad to have you here in Utah.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.